Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines of the hour. Iran says it is prepared to dilute highly enriched uranium if the United States lifts all sanctions, according to its atomic energy chief. The statement comes as talks with Washington resume, with no clarity on which sanctions would be removed. Downing Street says Prime Minister Keir Starmer will not resign and is focused on governing despite intense pressure over the Epstein scandal. The statement comes hours after his chief of staff and communications director quit over controversy. Media tycoon Jimmy Lai is sentenced to 20 years in prison after being convicted of colluding with foreign forces and publishing seditious material. The verdict ends Hong Kong's largest national security case and fuels global concern over Beijing's curbs on the city's freedoms. China says the sentence for Jimmy Lai is legitimate and lawful, insisting the case upholds the rule of law. The European Union, the United Nations and press freedom groups condemn the ruling, calling for Lai's immediate release and warning it undermines press freedom in Hong Kong. Iran's supreme leader, the Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, calls on Iranians to show resolve ahead of the anniversary of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. He says national strength lies in the will of the people, urging unity against foreign pressure. The Prince and Princess of Wales say they are deeply concerned by newly released documents linked to Jeffrey Epstein. Kensington Palace says their focus remains on the victims as renewed scrutiny falls on figures tied to the late financier. Japan's Prime Minister Sanai Takaichi says the country will steadfastly protect its territorial waters and airspace. Speaking after a landslide election win, she pledges to strengthen defences and stresses self-reliance in national security. The European Union condemns Israeli decisions to tighten control of the West Bank and pave the way for more settlements. EU officials say the measures are a step in the wrong direction and undermine the prospects for peace. Those are the headlines for the hour. We head to our top story, and in the 3.5 million pages of the newly released documents in the Epstein files, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been mentioned over 1,000 times. According to reports, the revelation by the US Department of Justice added momentum to the allegation that the late sex offender was a Russian spy. The documents showed multiple times that Epstein desperately wanted to meet Putin, and there were multiple occasions when Epstein expressed his desire to meet the Russian Supremo. However, there's no evidence that the two ever met. However, the Kremlin dismissed the claims of the late American sex offender being a Russian spy, and in a press conference, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, when asked about whether Epstein was a Russian agent, dismissed the claims, calling it a joke and a waste of time. Alison Mutler joins us now. She's a former Associated Press bureau chief. She joins us live from Bucharest. Thank you so much, Alison, for joining us. What this story does show is Jeffrey Epstein's intentions to connect and be influential in all spheres of the world. Of course, Moscow, far away from those mentioned directly in association with Epstein. But what does that say about the power, about the influence that the will of Epstein can be taken seriously, that he did want to meet the Russian president, and that it could in some way maybe have been made possible?
Well, I think without any shadow of a doubt that Jeffrey Epstein did want to meet Putin and made multiple efforts. From the material I read from the files, he tried all kinds of avenues through the former Israeli Prime Minister Barak, through Norwegian contacts. He tried to get to Putin through his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. So he did try repeatedly over the years, because Putin is incredibly powerful and has been at the forefront of international politics for many years. There's no clear evidence has emerged that Epstein and Putin did meet, but that doesn't mean that Epstein did not meet people in his inner circle. The other day, I published a story which came from an independent Russian outlet that said that Epstein got a visa to visit Russia, or tried to, through veteran members of the FSB. Now, for your viewers, the FSB is like the successor to the KGB. So Epstein did have links. Whether he met Putin or not, that is unclear. But that doesn't mean that he didn't meet people or officials who were very high up in the Kremlin. But what Epstein wanted was to gain access to someone with massive power, and also with somebody who was very used to influence operations, blackmail, and that kind of wheeling dealing, which the Soviet Union was based on, and that was carried on into modern day Russia.
Exactly, and of course Epstein remains a floating symbol of elite political corruption. Every major power seemingly being pulled into this orbit. Where does this case fit into US-Russia information warfare?
Well, I think that the Russians they denied he's a spy, but that could be very technical denial. I mean, there's all kinds. He could have been an agent, an asset, an occasional asset. I mean, it seems clear that he was an occasional asset because of his links. And the lines are very blurred about what he did, how much he operated. It's clear it's a total corruption, which is something that Russia is known about. And his role there, I mean, he was also a contact of Donald Trump, who the Russians had their eyes on for some time. This is part of how perhaps the informal network of Russian-American relations behind the scenes, not the formal network with the governments of Moscow and Washington, but the informal links, the informal networks, which also involves, there was prostitution, trafficking, financial fraud. So there are these informal links, which are I don't know whether we call them soft power, but they're not the official. They're not the press releases you see out of the Kremlin or the White House. But these links are very important, because that's how relationships are made. And if you see with Epstein's emails, it's tell Putin, I know this, I know how he can work Donald Trump. It's very simple. I know how Russia can do business in America. It's very simple. I have the inside story. So you have all these informal networks working, and they may have borne fruit. They are part of the US-Russian relations, just not the official ones.
Yes, Alison, do stay with us as we turn to our next story. Of course, we'll continue to cover all those breakthroughs when it comes to the Epstein files. We now move on, and Moscow's ambassador to Paris, Alexei Meshkov, has accused France and Ukraine of supporting terrorist groups in Russia-friendly African nations. He stated that France, facing failures in Africa, is blaming Russia and countering it in various ways, including cooperating with Ukrainian intelligence agencies and backing terrorist groups. Meshkov added that these efforts are aimed at weakening the emerging independent governments in Africa. He also criticized France for shifting its stance on cooperation with African nations, particularly after countries in the Sahel region began pursuing more independent policies, no longer seeing themselves as France's sphere of influence. Alison Mutler joins us once again. Alison, what and how big is Russia's influence in Africa? How important is it to Moscow? And is there any evidence to these claims that Western powers are supporting terrorist groups to obstruct them?
Well, the first question, Russia's footprint in Africa is growing and it wants it to grow. China also, another one of the world's superpowers, also has influence in Africa, and Africa is seen as, you know, underdeveloped and underexploited. So you do have Russia and China vying for influence there. It was much more under French influence before. There was some British influence, Dutch influence, etc. But that is like more than a century ago. So Russia does see this as very, very important to it. And it is trying to grow its influence there, and it wants to be, you know, wants to be a world power, and it sees Africa as a place where it can do business, where it can extend its influence. Now, the accusations the Kremlin is making about France and Ukraine promoting terrorism, I think it is. I looked at some disinformation from the European Union. This is a narrative that's been promoted over, particularly in recent years since the war since Russia invaded Ukraine. So this is a narrative, a Russian disinformation narrative that is promoted to say that France is basically supporting terrorists, that Ukraine is supporting terrorists. But if you actually look at the details, because France and Ukraine do have a presence there, the organizations they represent are nowhere classified as terrorist organizations. So what Russia is doing is taking a seed of something and making it into something else and make it seem much worse, and make it seem that in fact that France and Ukraine are terrorists. Or what do they call? They call Ukraine Nazis. So that is part of their disinformation narrative that they spread around the globe. And it's because Russia wants to have more influence in Africa and have influence over those the countries that it finds interesting.
Alison Mutler, thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. We now turn over to West Asia for our next update. And as per the IDF, the forces have killed 4 terrorists in Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip after they emerged from an underground tunnel and opened fire on troops. It described the attack on Israeli troops as a violation of the US brokered ceasefire with the Palestinian Islamist group Hamas that went into force in Gaza last October, and said it views it with the utmost gravity. Israel has responded to similar incidents in recent months by carrying out airstrikes across the enclave in which dozens of people have been killed. While there's no immediate response from Hamas, some sources close to the group identified one of those killed as Anas Shah, the son of a former senior Hamas politician. As per reports, dozens of Hamas fighters have been trapped in tunnels under Rafah since the ceasefire, and some have been killed in clashes with Israeli forces. In a separate incident, Israeli forces shot and killed a Palestinian farmer in Deir al-Bala in the central Gaza Strip. The Gaza Health Ministry said at least 580 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli fire since the October ceasefire deal was agreed. Israel says 4 soldiers had been killed by terrorists in Gaza over the same period. Dr. Emmanuel Navon joins us now, an international relations lecturer at Tel Aviv University and senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He joins us live from Tel Aviv. Dr. Navon, thank you very much for speaking to us here on the channel. Israeli forces say they've killed 4 alleged militants in Rafah after they emerged from an underground tunnel and opened fire on IDF troops. How common are these violations? Because one, of course, could say that there's allegations on both sides of as this ceasefire remains particularly fragile. And what are your hopes for the stabilization of phase 2, given the nature that stage 1 has been carried out?
Well, I think we got an answer yesterday from senior Hamas terrorist Khaled Mashhad, who said very clearly and openly that Hamas has absolutely no intention of laying down its arms and of disarming the Gaza Strip. So I think the intentions of Hamas are very clear. It wants to hold on any territory that it still controls in the Gaza Strip. It refuses to lay down its arms despite the catastrophe that it has brought upon the residents of Gaza, and despite the complete defeat of Hamas. It is still holding on some territory and some weapons, and unfortunately, as long as Hamas refuses to lay down its arms, as it is expected to do by the ceasefire agreement, it will not be possible to move on to the next stages of the ceasefire agreement.
Dr. Navon, of course, one can look at the statistics and the figures that are coming out of the Gaza Health Ministry and say at least 576 Palestinians have now been killed by Israeli strikes or fire since the ceasefire went into effect on October the 10th of last year. 4 Israeli soldiers have been killed in the same amount of time. What does this say about how and when Israel are using such weaponry in force against Hamas, given the sheer difference in number? Of course, Israel is the more technologically advanced when it comes to its weapons, etc. So how does the Israeli state dignify that huge difference in numbers there?
Well, first of all, this figure has zero credibility. You yourself said, according to the health ministry in Gaza, but of course, that health ministry is controlled by Hamas. And therefore, those figures are produced by Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization recognized as such by most countries in the world. It has lied repeatedly about those figures since the beginning of the war, and therefore, any figure provided by Hamas under the false cover of the Gaza Health Ministry have zero credibility. Now, there have been many instances...
Dr. Navon, of course, this came after senior Israeli military officials for the first time said that Israel accepts that around 70,000 Palestinians have been killed during the Gaza war. If that figure was accurate, why isn't this one?
Well, first of all, the figure of 70,000 was not necessarily produced by Hamas, but the one you gave right now specifically of 500, as I said, comes from Hamas. Now, there are in fact in Israel itself different estimations. There is no consensus among Israeli military experts about the exact number of victims on the Gaza side in the war that ended, partially at least, in October. But when Hamas supplies figures, these are simply not reliable. This is not to say, of course, that there are no side victims to the continued violation of the ceasefire by Hamas. There are such victims, but all I'm saying is that the figures have to be taken with a pinch of salt, definitely when it comes from Hamas. Now, we know that many Hamas terrorists have been violating the agreement, have been crossing the line between the Hamas-held territory and the Israeli-held territory, and therefore Israel has no other choice but to retaliate when this line is being crossed.
Okay, but of course, those numbers which came out a few days ago, the senior Israeli Defense Force officials, they briefed journalists and the media that Israel's own data shows 70,000 Palestinians killed in October plus, since October 2023, a figure of which, of course, is really similar to Gaza's health ministry tally. If Gaza's health ministry was telling the truth then and agree with the Israeli officials, why aren't they telling the truth now?
Well, when it comes to Hamas, the reliability of its figures has always to be taken with skepticism. And as I said before, even the figures of 70,000, there's no consensus in Israel about that figure. But at the end of the day, we also have to look at the wider picture, which is the ratio between civilian and military victims in zones of conflict, in zones of war. And the ratio of civilians to military is, in fact, lower in that war than it was in areas of combat led by NATO forces in Iraq and in Syria. And this is in a very densely populated area. So even though every human death is a tragedy, the fact is that for such a densely populated zone with underground fighting, the ratio of civilian to military casualties in that war is actually lower proportionally than it was in areas of fighting where NATO forces were involved in the Middle East.
Dr. Navon, those numbers are very much disputed, of course, by various agencies, by various international actors. These things could be checked if international journalists, international bodies were let inside Gaza to check these things, to make sure these things are rigorous. Do you think it's time that happens?
Well, I think that now that a ceasefire has been reached, first of all, there are more journalists who've been allowed in the Gaza Strip. It's still a very dangerous area, but don't forget that Israel only controls about half of the territory of the Gaza Strip at this point. And in the area controlled by Hamas, any claims about the ability or the inability of journalists to enter have to be brought to Hamas itself, which still controls about half of the Strip. The one that is controlled by Israel, still controlled by Israel, there have been more journalists visiting those areas. Maybe there should be more. But as I said, as of the ceasefire in October, Israel has retained control on about half of the Gaza Strip, and not all of it.
Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World and taking the time. This was a great pleasure to get your insight on these issues. We now move on to our next story, and some breaking news is coming in. The United States of America has now reacted to the sentencing of Hong Kong's Jimmy Lai. US Secretary of State Rubio has called the Jimmy Lai sentencing unjust and a tragic conclusion. He's also urged authorities to grant Lai humanitarian parole. The United States there, much like the rest of the world, reacting to the 20-year sentence of the pro-democracy billionaire Jimmy Lai, who has now been sentenced to 20 years in prison. But next we turn to Latin America, and Venezuelan authorities have stated that they are seeking court approval to place opposition politician Juan Pablo Guanipa under house arrest after he was forcibly taken by armed men in Caracas. Pablo's son and opposition leader, Marina Corina Machado, described the incident as kidnapping. The move came soon after Guanipa was released from jail, where he had spent over 8 months being accused of leading a terrorist plot. Officials claimed he violated the terms of his release without giving legitimate details. This incident raises concerns regarding government promises to pass an amnesty law and free political prisoners, as rights groups report recent releases. We move on now, and international war crimes prosecutors have said that Kosovo's former president, Hashim Thaqi, controlled ethnic Albanian guerrillas and should be convicted of war crimes and sentenced to 45 years in prison. Thaqi and other 3 ex-Kosovo Liberation Army commanders are charged with persecution, murder, torture, and forced disappearances of people during and shortly after the 1998 to 99 uprising that eventually brought independence for the Albanian majority region from Serbia. Meanwhile, a prosecutor and a deputy president of Kosovo War Veterans Association has responded. Let's listen in.
Are not sought against the General Staff nor against the KLA. Equally, no conviction is sought and no sentence can be imposed on the sole basis of being a member of the General Staff or of the KLA. Rather, the SPO has requested convictions on all 10 counts and the imposition of a single sentence of 45 years based on the individual contributions to the crimes which are charged in the indictment, made by each of Hashim Thaqi, Kadri Veseli, Recep Salimi, and Jakub Krasniqi. These crimes are war crimes and crimes against humanity and are grave in nature. And the gravity of the charges has not diminished with the passage of time.
Prandaj, gjithë procesi është furnizuar me materiale nga prokuria e Serbisë, ju e dini, është furnizuar me dëshmitarë jo kredibil, të cilët nuk kanë qenë fare ndoshta as në luftë, as se kanë pa luftën, as nuk kanë qenë pjesëmarrës në luftë që me dëshmua, apo me qenë dëshmitarë okular të asaj që ka ndodhur. Prandaj për neve këto janë tepër pra pranueshme dhe kjo gjykatë mendojmë se për themelimit të saj ka qenë e njëanshme, vazhdon të jetë e njëanshme, edhe mendojmë që ka qenë politike edhe është duke vazhdu me bë aktivitetin e saj politik, sepse për ndryshe nuk kishte pas fare mundësi as më ngrita këtë akuzë me këto provat pa baza.
Well, that's all that we have time for this hour. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.